The system of policing nurtures and draws out and cultivates the worst aspects of people. We have to be very brutal in our indictment of systems, as it takes it away from just looking at these people like villains.
Dr. Chenjerai Kumanyika is a Peabody Award-winning audio journalist and assistant professor of journalism at New York University. His latest podcast, Empire City, the Untold Origin Story of the NYPD, quote, takes listeners on a journey to uncover the hidden history of the largest police force in the world. From its roots in slavery to rival police gangs battling across the city to everyday people who resisted every step of the way. On this episode, we explore some of the stories told by Chenjerai in Empire City, both personal and historical, to illuminate the past, present, and potentially the future of New York City's relationship to their police. With the national spotlight yet again on the corruption and the escalating violence of this increasingly militarized police force, it is essential to understand the true roots of the NYPD and to see that even after close to 200 years, so much remains the same. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I am so excited to welcome Chenjerai today. It is going to be such a cool episode. I've just been listening through some of your podcast and it is just fantastic. And I'm just really honored and excited that you're here. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Love the show. And really, really excited. Thank you.
Oh, great. Well, let's get into it. I would love if we could start with your personal connection to the show that you're making, to the history of the NYPD. I know that you have, a connection with your father and then even with your own daughter. So if you wouldn't mind just getting a little personal right away and just telling us what it meant to you to make this show and why you did it.
Well, yeah. I think that policing is a thing that's been out there as a real important and visible social issue for so many folks for a long time. And it's been that way for me. And I've had a sense that I wanted to understand police better. But one thing that really kind of plunged me into this journey was that I saw this video of my father. My father died in 1993 and I had never seen a moving picture of him because, back then you didn't have Instagram, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's like you didn't have this ability to have all these images of our loved ones. And yeah, so I saw this picture and I pretty much thought I never would see an image of my dad moving.
Yeah.
And then I saw this image and it turns out that image was a surveillance footage that was shot by the NYPD. They were surveilling my father. The NYPD had basically kind of targeted him because of the activism and organizing he was doing.
Wow.
And, that really stuck out to me because most of the time when we talk about policing, a lot of times we're talking about incidents of police brutality. We're talking about, police, killing. But these are all incidents that people can kind of say this is like a rogue cop or it was bad training or maybe the person who was assaulted or killed deserved it. That we definitely get a lot of that.
Oh, yeah.
But in this case, my dad was fighting for, to try to stop racial discrimination in construction. And he was actually protesting a police brutality incident. But my dad was with Congress of Racial Equality. And the kind of things that they were protesting are basically things that I think a lot of us, pretty much most of us, think we should have in terms of rights, in terms of housing. People don't want segregation, those kinds of things. And yet there was an entire unit of the NYPD that was dedicated, funded by taxpayers to actually targeting and spying and stopping these people. Right.
Right.
And so that to me is a different way to enter the conversation about police that was personal because it made me understand my dad was somebody who kept me safe. And now the NYPD literally named him as one of the most dangerous people in New York.
Wow.
Because he was trying to make America a democracy.
Wow. Imagine that, right?
Yeah. So that's kind of like the past, right? My father and me trying to go back and understand him and through him to understand really what the NYPD is as an institution. But then, there's also a connection I have thinking about the future. I have a 5-year-old daughter. She just turned 5. She was 4 for most of the, making of this show. And I started noticing that police were also becoming a part of her life, and that the NYPD was becoming a part of her life. When I would drop her off at her little daycare places or child, the schools and pre-K, there would be police there, NYPD officers. And even, we would have relatives, despite my best protests, would hit her with like police toys, Paw Patrol. I mean, police are kind of a lot of places, you know what I mean? I don't know if you want to go through all the pop cultural things. You realize, actually, that's just really police, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What I noticed was that police were already in my daughter's life. And I started having some conversations with her to try to understand what is she picking up. And as I had those conversations, I was struck with a real problem, which is, how do I teach my daughter about what the police are in a way that doesn't just produce the sort of their PR talking points, but also allows her to kind of form her own opinion. It doesn't actually also just hit her with my talking points, right? As an activist, I want her to have her own journey of discovery, but I also want her to, to understand. And that was where really delving into the history. I said, well, you know what? Actually, in some ways, the things that my daughter needs to know are things that we all need to know, both as New Yorkers and as Americans, about where the institution of policing came from. We need to have a real account of what has happened.
Yes.
And when I looked into that, what was so fascinating was like the way in which, you would think with all the incidents of, that we saw was, sort of what could be called like the Black Lives Matter decade, that everybody would know a lot about the history of the police. But when I would ask people just kind of informally, like, do you know where the first police departments were formed, why they were formed, who formed them, what was the reasons? Could you name like the first 4 or 5? It's like most people just had no idea. And if you can't name the first 4 or 5, there's 18,000 police departments in this country.
Yeah.
So I was like, wow, if we don't know that basic history, we're not very well prepared to actually begin to solve the problems. The historian Khalil Gibran Muhammad said, imagine a doctor, right, who you go into the doctor and they don't ask your medical history. They have no idea about what has ailed you before, what other doctors have tried, what's worked for you, that, trying to cure you or even diagnose you without knowing that history would be absurd.
Yes.
And of course, in a doctor's office, the stakes are very high, right? And time is a factor. And the same is true with police in the sense that the stakes are high and people are like, oh, we don't have time for the history, but I think we have to make time for it. So that was why I kind of embarked on this project.
And yes. And I think that you and I share perhaps this feeling and idea that without understanding the history, it's just very difficult to engage in the present in a way that is going to be the most powerful and maybe the most complete, right? Because we go over these talking points that we have that are all very important and modern, but without the roots of how this came to be, which really shines a light, we're not getting at the heart really of the issue. And so I love your project and that you're doing this. And I think especially there's a line, and I wish I would have written it down, but there is a moment in the first or second episode where someone from the NYPD basically says that not much about policing has changed since the mid 1800s. And that felt like, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm trying to think if that was Bratton. It was a police commissioner said, yeah, the face of policing has changed, but the job nature of the work essentially has not changed since 1845, which
wild.
Should be a very jarring statement.
Yes, I should say so. Okay, maybe we could start back. Would you mind talking a little bit about the early days of what would become policing?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that I'll actually share with you some little tea that is not in the show per se, but really, if you really want to understand policing in New York, you got to go back to the 17th century. Ooh. And, Peter Stuyvesant, who kind of like was the Dutch governor of New York, was also, someone who was, a slave owner. And I saw an ad in which he was actually trying to find an enslaved person, a fugitive. And essentially that early form of policing in New York kind of goes back even way further than where we started. We chose to start in the 19th century because we wanted to kind of explore the origins of that 1845 date that's on the police cars, yes. Right? So we came a little closer to that. And turns out there was also slavery going on then. But, that is just one interesting thing, that it really goes all the way back. And I just find that fascinating in New York, because I think when you think about slave patrols, most people don't think about New York.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like if I say picture slave patrols, if that's something you've ever thought about, and I know not everyone has, but if you have, you're probably picturing like Harriet Tubman running through the woods with dogs chasing her, that kind of thing. Yep. Mm-hmm. It's very Southern kind of lineage. But we're talking about New York, right? We're talking about the financial capital. And so anyway, we started in the 1830s. And by this time, you do have like a constable system in place. So you have constables and watchmen, but they're really nothing like the police we have now, right? Like they don't have uniforms. They don't have badges even. And they're not paid full time. They're kind of almost like, they're very entrepreneurial, right? Like people would sometimes alert them if something happened, but there was no idea that they were preventing anything, right? So they were kind of like these guys and people really didn't respect them. You know what I mean?
Right,
That's the other thing, Chelsey. They did not respect these people. So it was like, I remember reading stories about how they would knock the police when the constables had hats, they would just knock them off. You know what I mean?
Right. Just some cartoonish shit.
Yeah. And they would be drunk and sleep. You know what I mean? They would fall asleep all the time. So these were just like on every level, not a prestigious organization. But, meanwhile, New York is growing, right? New York is becoming larger. It's becoming more complex. And people want to kind of make it into the kind of place where people can do business. And so it's in that scene that we kind of, this is like sort of the stages right before the NYPD starts. Now, the other thing about this period, which is crucial to this show, is that you have a growing Black population in New York of actually a lot of very educated Black people, right? Some of whom have escaped slavery, right?
Yes.
And kind of realizing that the police, are oppressing them in various ways, including that the police are, coming after them. Maybe we can get into the specifics of that in a minute.
Sure.
What was interesting to me about these early Black New Yorkers is that, one, they had no illusions that the police were on their side. They were very clear that there are police here, but they're not here to help us. Mm-hmm. And because of that, I was very interested to learn from them, right? Not to look at us as, oh, we're so more advanced than them and poor them, they were in slavery. I mean, certainly that was the case. But it was also like, what strategies did they have that we could learn from?
Yeah.
Was one. And that was a really important reason why I wanted to kind of understand those folks, right? And to just really see what the strategies of resistance were. Because so often when we talk about these moments of oppression in American history, it just becomes kind of like something that starts to look like trauma porn in a way after a while, right? Like here's another story of people being exploited. And we have to tell those hard truths, but we also have to show that people didn't take this stuff. You know what I'm saying? They didn't just accept it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So before we get the official police department, right? We're talking about the slave patrols who are connected to the South and that they are kidnapping people on behalf of Southern plantation owners. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that kind of turned into the NYPD as an official organization? I know there's a little bit of space between those, but would you share about that?
So essentially, Black New Yorkers in the 1830s realized that people are being kidnapped. Imagine coming home and realizing that your partner is gone, your child is gone. This was happening and no one knew where they were. And what had actually happened was that someone in the South claimed a free Black person in New York as their property. Mm-hmm. And then there was a group of people who were kidnapping those people and selling them for money. So it kind of became like there was an economic thing going on where you could make money anytime somebody claimed that there was a fugitive slave in New York, which was happening all the time. Right.
Right.
But the problem was that they couldn't go to the police because if you or I had someone who was kidnapped, we probably, we might go to the police. Right.
Yeah.
But they couldn't because the people that were kidnapping them were a group that included police officers. Right. It was led by a police officer named Tobias Boudinot. And he was also linked in with judges and other people in the legal system who could essentially make sure, because there was still kind of a court process that had to go through. I would call it more of a court theater, but they would drag the person in, want to sort of verify the claim. And the judge would say, yes, this person is a fugitive. And then they would be sent to slavery. And, a lot of these people Many of the people who were being sent were born free, but that doesn't make it any, whether you were born free or escaped, it didn't matter. It just was still horrible. And I guess one thing I really want people to understand is that this kidnapping of people, of Black people, was one expression of the economic incentives of policing at that time.
Yes.
So there was a lot of ways in which police were exploiting people for economic gain. And this was so bad that I was reading a city council document that was sort of arguing for a new police force. This was in 1842. Mm-hmm. And it essentially said there's a real kind of evil baked into the constable system. It said, if the policeman stops crime, he deprives himself of bread. It was something very close to that. Those were exact words.
Wow.
So that's like, so what was fascinating to me about this was I'm like, the first modern police in New York was already a reform project.
Yeah.
Before the date that's on the cars as the first police force, people were already saying the police don't work.
Yes. Yep.
So the question is, what was going to happen when they improved it? And particularly, what was that going to mean for all kinds of folks in New York, including Black people, right? And so they do kind of modernize the police. And it's interesting because a lot of the things that they do in 1845, when they make the new police force, this guy named George Matzel is the first chief, is the kind of things that you hear people talking about today that are going to make the police better, totally. Right? They're like, we're going to make them more professional, right? They give them badges for the first time. They give them, some resources. They give them, they're salaried, and they give them training, right? And they kind of try to organize them, There are several police scholars who have pointed out, though, that when it comes to policing, often the model of professionalization is really just more militarizing.
Yeah. Yes.
Police becoming professional always means becoming more military. And so in a way, if you think about police militarization, a lot of people, it's like, oh, that happened in the 60s with SWAT and all this other stuff. It's like, no, it actually was right from the beginning. Literally, anytime they said we have to train, we have to become more professional, they were also becoming more military.
Yeah, it's like baked into it.
Right. They were doing drills and, the whole thing. So we kind of move from the first episode into the second episode where we're seeing the first modern police force, the NYPD, be formed. And we also see the way that this is kind of driven by the media.
More after this. And now, back to the show. Every time I hear you going back into the old newspapers, it's just exactly what we do on our show. And it is probably the thing that I get the most out of personally, and really is the best record of the past. And in many ways, the only record of the past, unless we're looking at people's personal writing and things like that. And, you really discovered how the media was shaping the idea of policing and the image of policing, as well as how, the police and the government started to kind of go hand in hand, and prominent people from the government. And that was so interesting to me. And so do you want to talk a little bit about the early role that media played in policing?
Yeah. That's one of the things I respect about your show is that you all do take a historical way of understanding things. And I think one of the reasons a lot of people don't do that is because, when you go into history, it fucks with you, right? Yeah. When you go into history, it decenters what you thought. Anytime you go to learn the real explanations of things historically, you got to be prepared for things to work differently than you thought. I think. I don't know what your experience is.
Yes, you sure do. You have to be very flexible, and you have to understand that, your narrative might not be the one that you uncover, and that's okay. And I think that in some ways is just as exciting, because you get to explain to people like, hey, let's look at this in a new way. We've looked at it this way a lot, and now we have new information that can illuminate the present. And newspapers.com is my almost most visited website.
Me too. I got love. Shout out to newspapers.com.
Oh my God. I've been trying to get them to get merch. I've sent them emails being like, I will wear a racing jacket.
Come on, we need that. We need the sponsorship. Come on, I'll do it. What do we need? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
you and me, man.
But also, like, what's wrong with us that we want to just constantly have our own assumptions disproven, and then we make podcasts to do that.
It's weirdly comforting to me. I don't know why, but I think it does help people enter into a conversation that's difficult too, right? It's like you have the same things that people hear that maybe they're going to reject because they've heard it too many times and it doesn't align with their own beliefs, whether they're pro-police, whatever. But then you get, here's the history of something. It's like more accessible. Like people can come into that without being like their feathers aren't as ruffled, and they can take in information, I think, that will lead them to a conclusion that you would like them to be led to, because of course we make shows for a reason, but it's just a different entry point. And I think it's really powerful. And that's part of the reason I'm just really digging this show you've made.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I feel the same way. And it's, and I think like, also for me, in this age where there's a lot of opinions and a lot of people are really resistant to what they perceive as other people's opinions, I like history because it's like, look, here's something that I'm going to argue is a set of facts. And if you don't like these facts, you can go find some other information, make your account, but don't, like if you don't like what I'm saying about police, don't get mad at me, get mad at the police who made that history.
Absolutely.
This is real. This is objectively, empirically true stuff here. You know what I mean? This isn't just like Chenjerai's perspective or no. Like I'm telling you, this happened.
This is it. I mean, it's right here in the newspaper from 1845.
It's here in the newspaper. So the thing that really hit me about the newspapers, well, one thing, honestly, and I'll just sort of confess that part of what I was up to there was, as you know, as a historian, that newspapers are a tremendous resource. And
yes,
I was like, can I make newspapers a sexy enough story to actually make it on a podcast and entertain people with it? Can I make historical methodology sexy? You know what I'm saying? That's what I was like.
You've done it.
So that was one thing. But the other thing was we took a tour with Greg Young. Shout out to the Bowery Boys podcast. And one thing Greg really helped me to understand was this was a time when newspapers had such a voice because you didn't also have like TV and the internet, like the president and people like that. They couldn't just talk directly to the public through TV or even radio, right? So there was no way to get directly to the only people who could kind of speak directly to the people were newspapers, at least when you're talking about on that massive scale. And so newspapers really could dictate the agendas. And of course, I mean, you're talking about James Gordon Bennett at that time and sensational journalism. But, he was kind of really setting the agenda, and the way he was setting the agenda sounded a lot to me like the types of things that you hear today. So that was another time for us to sort of point out that the way that history is repeating and continuing and rhyming, where it's like, our city is being taken over by chaos and crime, and it's dangerous, and its particular kinds of people are dangerous. And if we want, the good people, the right people to be safe, if we want our city to be safe for business, we have to do something about these kind of miscreants and terrible people. And I was like, wow, that kind of sounds like what I'm hearing now. And it's that kind of media discourse, that story, which is just as it was back then, today is completely detached from any kind of factual reality. Right? In 1845, there was a murder that we'll learn about that's important. But, that murder was not the way people were dying. People were dying from disease. People were dying from poverty. There was things that people needed protection from. Okay.
Yes.
But like to paint the danger as a particular class of people was, a way that essentially they justified building up this police department. And you kind of see the same thing today. Like the way danger and public safety is talked about leads to particular kinds of investments. And they're not the investments that actually keep people safe. Right? Because when it comes to actually preventing crime and when it comes to actually keeping people safe, I mean, I say this with, I want to really be respectful here, but ask the people in Uvalde, if the police prevented crime.
Yes.
So we kind of explore what becomes of this force, and we see essentially this police force get created, and we also see who gets policed and who doesn't, right? What we find is that once the police force has been trained and, sort of modernized and made into a professional entity, it's strange how some of the things they're doing look a lot like what they were doing before.
Yeah.
And in some ways, they're even better at it and more effective.
Yeah, I think it's a reason that both parties, use the platform of law and order to this day. It's baked into the foundation of not only policing, but politics and media. I mean, everybody seems to benefit from this story of a certain group of people, run amok and, they need to be stopped, and we're the ones to do it.
Yes, absolutely. I think that that narrative of law and order, it unfolds in our show around the time when the NYPD is formed in 1845. And then it circles back, and that same story keeps coming back throughout the course of the history that we explore over the next 100 or so years. So, it's fascinating. And I would say, this is something to maybe say later when we get a little deeper, but I just am going to say it now, that as the police are moving forward based on this law and order narrative, that they're somehow attacking the real danger and protecting us, right? Mm-hmm. But what they're in fact doing is a lot of times stopping people from, having rights. They're restricting people's rights. They're preventing people from really living in a real kind of democracy. I think that what's happening actually is that we're seeing the police evolve as an anti-democratic force. Today I was looking at some of the stuff that's happening around the world relative to climate change, mm-hmm. right? And I said, wow, one of the major fronts of climate change is in New York, not just because we're having floods and stuff like that, but because, when you see climate protesters protesting like Citibank, and when you see, people in the streets protesting some of these different institutions and marching, they're doing that because literally some of the problems we have in the world, the people creating those problems live in New York and people are protesting it. So when you see a climate protest in New York, and then you see the NYPD come down to put down that climate protest, when you see the NYPD dealing in certain ways, arresting a 14-year-old girl who's vending fruits with her mom as an immigrant, what you're basically seeing is the NYPD being on the wrong side of democracy, some of the biggest battles of democracy that we have. And yeah, I think it's just a thing that we have to grapple with when we talk about the future of policing. I just wanted to say that. Absolutely.
And I think anyone who's ever been to a protest where things, start to get violent and the police start to get violent, it seems like kind of a tale as old as time in terms of who they're reacting to, why they're reacting, and who they're protecting. And, it's like most people I know who have been to many protests at some point have gotten, a flash grenade thrown in their direction. I've seen children in protests and flash grenades are thrown in their direction. It's the complete and utter opposite of protecting. And that, I remember your daughter in your episode saying, what was it exactly? You asked her about the police and what they mean to her. And she said, the police protect us. And it was a heartbreaking moment. And it's something that, I'm sure is heavy on your mind and so many people's minds all the time. And oh gosh, yeah, it's just, we're in a mess, aren't we, right now?
Yeah. Yeah, no, we are. And it was, and that was an intense moment, because again, you have to say, okay, well, how do I help her understand? And I think it also was complicated because if my daughter is in a position where she feels like she needs to call the police, I want her to be able to do that. I want to empower her to do whatever she has to do to survive, to stay safe, to thrive.
Yeah.
But,
yes.
So, you know what I'm saying? Like, I want her also to understand that as she makes those decisions, that don't just call the police just because they always tell you they make you be safe. And then you need to understand situations where people call the police and they were not made safe. You need to talk to some, domestic people who work with the thing that's called domestic violence, and some of the people who work in that field and some of the feelings they have about police. Mm-hmm. But anyway, to go back, one thing I'll say just to bring us back to the episode is, by 1846, the NYPD is an institution that now has 900 officers working for it. And that's a far cry. That's probably about, I don't know how many watchmen and constables there were, but that's probably at least 800 more.
Yeah.
So what you're going to see in the show is a moment where there's 900 officers called out to do something. And when I think we're so used to seeing police, because now in New York, for example, there's, 30,000+ cops. But back then, to see 900 officers,
terrifying.
That would have been terrifying. And I think that that's what we really want people to feel and understand. One other thing I'll tell you that is a thing that's related to the show. This is a thing we tried to put in the show, but we decided that it was a little too hard to render it and to keep it moving. So but I'll share it with you because it's kind of like an episode 2 thing.
Okay, please.
So in downtown New York, there's a sort of monument that is meant to commemorate American revolutionary soldiers and revolutionary fighters who were imprisoned by the British.
Mm-hmm.
So when the British kind of were here, ruling New York, and during the struggle in which Americans tried to fight for American independence, the British would take over these sugar houses where they were like sugar factories and turn them into prisons. So there's a big prison called the Sugar House Prison, right? And they would actually British would put Americans in that prison. And there's a memorial to that downtown. And you can actually see it, like there's bars, like it's in a wall, and you go down there and you see like these bars, and then there's a plaque that says, this is to commemorate, people who were imprisoned by the British. And people who lived back in those times remembered that. In 1845, people who had survived the Revolutionary War were still very much remembered that. Some people were alive.
Right.
And to them, the idea of a uniformed police force would have been terrifying, right? Which is why it's sort of amazing that literally the NYPD headquarters is built on top of that prison.
Wow.
It's literally 10 feet. It's like, it's 10 feet from the NYPD where you walk into One Police Plaza.
No way. Wow.
So the biggest police force in America is built on top of a monument to people who were imprisoned by the British. It's kind of amazing.
You need to learn history. The stuff you learn is so wild. Okay. Ooh, a scoop. I love it.
That's an exclusive I just gave you, Chelsey. Nobody knows it.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, so where does the series go next after the things we've already talked about?
Well, so you have this police force, and we kind of jump forward about 10 years because what we're looking at is that now that you have a professional NYPD, politicians really kind of start rubbing their hands together and realizing that like this police force is something they can use. And, as we dug into this history, what we started seeing in the contemporary moment and that history that reminded us of today was mayors, right? Really have to have a kind of relationship with the police force.
Right.
Right. If a mayor does not have a strong support of the police, it's going to be pretty hard to govern. But then at the same time, that creates this problem, right? Where the police should actually be answering to the people, not to the mayor, right?
Right.
I mean, we're talking,
Yes.
again, people, we're talking about democracy. You gotta, you gotta keep reminding Americans. They're like, be loyal to the president. It's like, do y'all just really want to go back to monarchy? Is that what it is to be?
Yeah. Well, you just missing your daddy or something.
Exactly. But it is kind of like a weird sort of hierarchy when you have like the mayor and the police force. And so what we look at is a historical example where a mayor of New York forms a very interesting relationship with the police, and some wild things unfold, which you'll see. But I think the things which happen, well, some of them, I think, if you don't know what happens, is going to kind of blow your mind.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that I think it's going to remind people of many figures today, right? I think that what happens to this particular mayor that we look at in New York, whose name is Fernando Wood, I think has echoes certainly with today's mayor, Eric Adams, and also even I think with bigger, politicians like Donald Trump. But we'll see if how people feel and if they make those connections. But we're just kind of like telling you how it all unfolds. And it was honestly like the story in episode 3 was one of those things where when I heard how it came out, I mean, what I knew is we're going to tell this story because the story is riveting.
Yes. Yes.
Is that arrogant to say about my own podcast? I'm saying hopefully we made it riveting.
You did.
My point is to say that when I read and learned the history, because you know how we are, Chelsey. I read history like other people read Marvel comic books. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, me too.
Watch Netflix shows. I'm in the, sometimes the language is a little dense, but I'm like, oh, wow. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, oh, shit. I'm in the archives. What?
Oh, yeah. You got to pull out. And then you pull out the good stuff and give it, and then you do the hard, boring work. And then you're like, well, I got this and this and this. And this is like the encapsulation of this story. And I can throw it out to you in a fun way that you're actually going to want to eat up.
Exactly. So I hope we did that. But
you did.
My point is that I just thought the story was kind of wild, and it took us a minute to try to extract what the political lessons were
sure.
from it. It was more like, I want to tell this because it's wild. And sometimes that is how you figure it out. Sometimes through putting the timeline together, putting the chronology together. Shout out to Donna Murch. She's an incredible historian, friend of mine. And she kind of said, really helped me to understand the way in which chronology can lead to understanding and it's always really important. So anyway, I think once you hit that point in the series, we're going to go off into some directions that people really don't predict. We go a lot of different places.
Yeah.
We talk about some really important moments in New York history. We talk about some stuff that is, we're going to talk about vice. We're going to talk about, sex and sex work in New York. We're going to talk about, corruption. All those things are going to unfold. We may even leave the shores of the United States later in the season, but folks will have to stay tuned to see what happens. And it's a real journey. And the whole time that those things are unfolding in the show, I'm learning more things about my father and, my daughter in this relationship. And my quest to really explain this to her is also kind of evolving over the course of these episodes so that, my daughter winds up in a very different place and we as a family are in a very different place by the end of the season than we were when I first asked her that question.
Yeah. And this is really, as soon as you started talking in your podcast, I was like completely there, right? I was just like, there's just something about watching the person evolve and learn, and you're like taking us through your process, right? You're like telling us like, I'm hitting the archives right now. I'm talking to this person. And there's just a way that we kind of get to go on this journey with you. And that feels so much more valuable. And it's just such a good inroad. And you're actually bringing like some heart to this. And it's just, I'm so excited to get to listen to the rest of this. There is a lot here. And so everybody just needs to subscribe immediately. And the other thing you do so well that I think relates kind of to the newspaper stuff we were talking about is you do follow the stories of individuals. And I really have found that that is one of the best ways to teach history is like, following this corrupt mayor, following the life of this Black abolitionist, and just like all the minutia, how they get there, their relationships to other people. And that is just like, I swear, that's how you can really get people engaged. I wish all of our history teachers growing up would have done that a bit more.
I agree.
Because it really does. Like, it brings you into it. You're like, I know someone like that. That's like this modern person. Like you said, it's like, this guy reminds me of Eric Adams. Like, seems like things haven't changed that much. And you just do such a great job of that.
Yeah, I'm glad that, our approach of thinking about characters is working for you. I got to say, when you get, before the 20th century, sometimes it's hard to find characters who live long enough to to do what you need them to do.
True.
That was one of the challenges for us was like, I wanted to find, Black people who are resisting the police. I wanted to find, I'm trying to think about diversity. The history of police can very easily become a history of all like old white men.
Right.
And so it's the way in which some of these other groups of people are silenced in the archives, not because other folks weren't doing stuff. We were really trying to find the right people to take us on those journeys. And I think that the people that we have found and the stories we found, hopefully folks will find them interesting. I think if you want to tell a real story, I had to have moments of, I was rarely sympathetic to police in the 19th century, but I certainly did have to try to understand what they might be feeling,
Yeah.
And what they were motivated by and those kinds of things. And so it does give you a different kind of take on how things work. One important takeaway about the police to me is that from the time when the police started, this is a job that working class people can get.
Yes.
And that's a big reason why a lot of people do it more so than any other kind of, motivation is that it's just a job people can get that has whatever level of security it had. Of course, back then it didn't have very much security or anything like that. But history also shows us that working class people who are handed a uniform and a gun and authority have committed some of the most horrific evils, in history. And, that certainly is the case with the police. And so what I think that teaches us is that we have to be very brutal in our indictment of systems and what systems do to people, right? I just don't look at people as bad people. I look at people sociologically.
Right.
I look at individuals who make bad choices and all these other kinds of things and had certain kinds of conditions that led to those choices. But, look, it might be that some of the, some people who wanted to do harm join up with the police to do that. But I think what happens more often is that people take the job either because it's just a job, or in some cases, people actually become police because they want to help.
Sure.
And what we see throughout our series, and we see it today, is that the system of policing nurtures and draws out and cultivates the worst aspects of people.
Oh.
It really just brings it out of them. It rewards them for eliciting, compliance, not trying to understand, for doing violence, performing violence, and for not questioning things, and for, assuming that people are criminals or dangerous or whatever. And it kind of rewards those things. The police who want to take their time, want to be a little bit more thoughtful, the police who are saying maybe the way we're doing this is wrong, the police who want to hold their partners accountable when they see things done and sort of break the blue wall of silence. NYPD really punishes those people.
Yeah. Back
in the 1890s, they're punished, and they're punished in the 1990s, and they're punished now. And so I think that for me, I think that focusing on individuals and seeing what policing does to people is actually one of the strongest indictments of the NYPD.
Yeah.
Right? Because it takes it away from just looking at these people like villains.
Definitely. And again, it's like, what are we going to reform? These individual people who act monstrously, or are we going to reform the system that not only allows them to act monstrously, but encourages them to do so? So I think punching at the system is usually the right thing to do. And if you have people that you can use as examples for how that system works, that's going to, give people an inroad to want to hear about it and to hopefully continue that indictment of the system. More after this. And now, back to the show. One of the things that I want to hear about, too, is how the NYPD, which I think is pretty unique, how the NYPD shows up in pop culture and in culture in general.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The NYPD, I think, is unique. I mean, of course, so much of pop culture has to do with police procedurals and true crime, and right, police are sort of everywhere. But I mean, I was talking to Jason Johnson. He was like, what other police department do people just wear their clothes? Like, you can go to Times Square and just buy the NYPD. Do people do that with the Detroit Police Department?
I don't think so. I don't even think the LAPD gets that.
You know what I mean? It's just like, you think about like John McClane from Die Hard, or you think about, NYPD Blue or Law and Order. I mean, it's just the NYPD. Of course, Law and Order has expanded all kinds of places, but yeah, they really, I think, have a certain kind of presence in pop culture. I mean, look, the NYPD has a whole aspect of, as an institution, that deals with being used in movies. Like, you can call them up if you want to have cops in movies. The NYPD has a whole sort of part of the department that deals with like Hollywood and showbiz, and you can like work with them to get cops. I mean, that just shows you right there that they had, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I didn't know that existed, though.
Yeah, they do. They have a whole section that just deals with that. I mean, and that's in addition to, I think the NYPD now has 86 PR reps.
Oh my God. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And so, I can't even imagine what 86 PR reps are doing. What are they doing?
Wasting taxpayer money, probably.
Well, that's the case.
Beyond that, yes.
But I do think it's important to think about the kind of stories that are being told about policing in pop culture. I mean, one thing that surprised me when I did start to look at how police in general show up in pop culture is that a lot of times police don't come off very well in pop culture. Who comes off a little bit better is the detectives.
Right.
But even the detectives are kind of complicated figures, right? When they emerge in pop culture and you start getting the detective noir, genre, they're already the detective. You look at like the Maltese Falcon and all this stuff. The detective is already kind of a shady, ambiguous character, right? We know has relations to the underworld. But, as that evolved, if you think about like a show like The Wire, for example, right? I mean, It's really, a lot of these police shows are about a detective who really wants to get to the bottom of it. And the police and the general system of policing is kind of like depicted as thugs. And they're often almost against. A lot of times the struggle in a lot of these shows is between a detective or maybe one good cop and the rest of the department.
That's so true.
So even going back to the 20s, one thing I found out was that there was an organization of police chiefs back in the 20s who actually formally made a formal complaint to Hollywood saying, we don't like how we're being portrayed. I mean, I think they might have been responding to like a Keystone Cops type of portrayal. But even then, right? Keystone Cops. I mean, this is like probably one of the first portrayals of cops on film, and they're clowns, right? And then they go from being clowns to, kind of being not able to really figure out a lot of crime. and the detectives come in as really the people who are the crime solvers. And then eventually you get to like Joe Friday and Dragnet. But that really is pretty late in the history, right?
Yeah.
And it's only a brief moment where you get Joe Friday as a very uncomplicated kind of character.
Yeah. Yeah.
And next thing you know, we're in another area. So, and then I would also just say, dealing with my daughter, right, and watching her world has opened me up to a whole other area where I see, oh, wow, okay, what is Paw Patrol?
Yeah.
I'll ask her, what are all these little teams and all these ways that the police are just present, and that idea of policing is kind of coming in as a natural way to understand the world, a natural way to understand danger and safety.
Yeah. So is Paw Patrol supposed to be the NYPD? Or is it a fictional?
I think that maybe, I mean, I tried not to watch it,
Sure.
but my sense is like one of the Paw Patrol, they're patrolling, but only one of them is like a cop. Maybe one of them is a fire person. I don't know.
Does he have a New York accent? Maybe we can figure it out.
Maybe we need to make that cartoon, and then this way we can get the real money,
Yeah, we need that cartoon money.
Subversive cop cartoon.
Yep, I like that. I like that. So Paw Patrol brings us to the modern day, and as of this recording on this very day, the NYPD commissioner just resigned. Like, I'm looking at my top stories, and it was like 18 minutes ago that the New York Times article came out, right? So it's like really recent. It involves a lot of questionable ethical things that the commissioner did. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we're looking at in terms of the modern era of the NYPD, including Eric Adams' involvement in all of this?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this kind of like breaking news that's happening, like, right now as we're talking.
Yeah.
It's sort of amazing because I'm sure people who are listening to Empire City and also like watching the news are probably thinking that maybe I have the FBI as part of my writing team or something. It's just like, wow, this is really, but I mean, that is also, I gotta say, having spent, a few years studying the NYPD, it's like they literally every day there's at least 2 or 3 headlines that are amazing. So
sure.
Yeah, Edward Caban has officially stepped down. We've known for at least a couple of days that it was likely that he would. And I think in terms of what it means right now, I mean, it's an interesting time because Eric Adams' administration is embattled in a number of ways. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think what you see with Edward Caban and some of the other scandals in the department are really evidence of what happens when you have a cop as mayor, right? And a cop who brings policing as his only tool of governance. And what that has meant for the police department, for the NYPD, is that he's raised their overtime pay. He's defended them and really made it hard for anybody almost impossible for anybody to hold them accountable, right? Because Edward Caban is resigning. They is a police commissioner. Keishant Sewell, the former police commissioner, resigned earlier. And I would say more than rumor has it that the reason why she resigned was because she tried to hold a police officer accountable.
Wow.
Based on a CCRB investigation. Meanwhile, she threw out more substantiated CCRB investigations than any previous commissioner. But the one she tried to hold him accountable for, which involved a cop who drew his gun on 3 kids, seems to have led to her being fired.
Wow.
So I just think that there's a culture there and a structure. People sometimes conflate culture and structure, by the way. I know I'm being really nerdy here, but when I say culture, I'm not just talking about like ways of understanding and ideas and food. I'm talking about a structure. I'm talking about a mayoral power that will essentially not allow police to be held accountable. And I think that that's just one important piece of this. What we know about Edward Caban is, ProPublica did some incredible reporting where they revealed that since he's been police commissioner, he has tossed out hundreds of cases.
Wow.
I think they said over 400, something like 430 cases that were in process in the Civilian Complaint Review Board. So, the first question is, if you really feel that maybe the police aren't guilty, let the investigation proceed. Why are you stopping an investigation in which, they're going through a process to figure out what happened? And another thing I just want to point out about that, right, is that when you see, like the commissioner stepping down and it's like scandal and the Adams administration is embattled, what I think people forget about is that every one of those cases involved people's lives, an experience someone had that was in many cases traumatic. And it was traumatic enough that they endured. It's not fun to go submit yourself to do a CCRB investigation. You might have to take off of work and spend time and deal with bureaucracy. But people are often motivated to go through all that because something happened that really hurt them, really offended them, violated their rights. And so when you throw out hundreds of those, that's a lot of the archive of, just suffering and wrongdoing by the NYPD that a lot of times just gets forgotten because there's so much of it. There's just a mountain of stuff. It almost reminds you in a way of the way that sometimes things proceed with former President Donald Trump, where like the stuff he's done has been so much that you actually forget. It's hard to actually quantify it, because you can't even remember, you lose track. You forget every day there's a new outrageous thing. And what I would say, though, about the NYPD and what motivated us to do this show, by the way, is that I felt like that archive of people whose rights were violated needs to be entered into the historical record. It needs to be part of the story we tell ourselves. And that archive, in a kind of bad way, is a unifier. It's good for people to be unified in certain ways, but it brings together people across race, class, gender, right? I mean, everybody from Russian Jews, Polish immigrants, Black people, women, queer folks. I mean, all these types of folks face real oppression in the 19th century at the hands of the NYPD. And I think that when I think about Edward Caban and him stepping down, I'm not thinking just about the scandal and spectacle. I'm thinking about the lives that were affected. And interestingly, though, even though you've had this reporting that has shown that he was bearing all these cases, that's not the thing that I think is the cause of him resigning. It seems to be related to his brother and something to do with his brother and how he was policing and dealing with his job in terms of policing nightlife or something like that. This is speculation.
Yeah, it was like maybe he was taking kickbacks from his brother's nightclub and potentially policing it in maybe a favorable way or something like that. So yeah, it's not even what you're talking about. It's something that doesn't even compare to the harm that he's actually done burying these cases.
But also that whole thing of kickbacks and kind of like, police who sort of first are sort of ostensibly policing, nightlife, vice, some particular area of New York life, and then they wind up kind of dipping their beaks in, so to speak, right? It's like that very much is, you're going to see that on Empire City. That's a very huge, really at this point, non-controversial part of NYPD history, right? I mean, one thing we reveal even in our teasers of the show is that the first person who uses the term organized crime is actually referring to the NYPD. He's not talking about the mafia. If you think about it, organized crime in terms of thinking about the mafia and all that kind of stuff, this is something that really doesn't happen until later in the 20th century mostly. And, but like, this guy is talking about it in terms of New York. And, he's talking about it in terms of the New York government and the police. He says, I'm not going to tell you who it is, but what he basically says is the problem is not just that the police are engaging in crime, it's organized crime.
Definitively.
Right?
Yeah.
So when I think about Edward Caban and what's going on right now, police commissioner stepping down, that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about those historical echoes.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the people whose lives are impacted, by that. I mean, and not just directly impacted, but these people are being paid a lot of money, and some of these cases lead to lawsuits, and then taxpayers are paying that. And that's money that could have been going to, public goods, could have been going to our schools, right? Education and having access to good food and having like flood protection and having like, those are the kind of things that I feel actually keep my daughter and my kids safe.
Absolutely. Yes.
And, when you see all this, what's called corruption, I think it actually, none of that is really about what's keeping my kids safe.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that that's a great place for us to kind of leave off here, because everything else that we need to talk about is in the show. So yeah, I just really hope everyone goes over, and I think we just barely scratched the surface. We got into some of the stuff in the early episodes, but I'm heading there probably right after this because I got access to the rest of the show. So I'm so excited to just absorb the rest of what I don't know. And you've already given us so much. So thank you. Is there anything else that you want to tell our listeners before we go?
Well, I just want to say that, I hope you enjoy the show. First of all, much respect and shout out to American Hysteria. Yeah, I thank you. I hope you listen. I hope you enjoy Empire City. And, we're going to be posting information for people who want to think about what we can also do to have an effect on this, right? Like, one part of this story is understanding and getting the history right. And the other part is connecting to the folks who are trying to, make change in different and positive ways. So, but mainly, man, I just thank you for having me on. Much respect for the work you're doing. And I can't wait for you to hear the rest of the show.
Oh, well, right back at you. I've just loved connecting with you. So thank you for being willing to come and talk to us today.
Absolutely. I can't wait till next time.
This was American Hysteria. Make sure you subscribe to Empire City wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to help us continue to make American Hysteria and get ad-free episodes and bonus content, you can head to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get access to Hysteria Home Companion, where producer Miranda and I tell you stories that were cut from the episodes or stories that we know that you'll love. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. It's a huge way to help us out. You can follow us on social media at American Hysteria Podcast and go to AmericanHysteria.com to leave us a message on our Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up or even one you've heard recently, and we might do a whole investigation about it. And you can also pick up some of our merch. American Hysteria is produced and edited by Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius Smith, and I'm your host, Chelsey Weber Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you have a great week.